Welcome, Rabies and Germs, to the Golden View, and as always, I am your host, Nicholas McConaughey, and you're watching this on the Masochist Gaming Network. The last two of my reviews, I've been taking looks and reminiscing over some of the games that frolicked merrily around my childhood. Games like Sly Cooper and Prince of Persia. And I've enjoyed revisiting them, and I hope to very soon pay a visit to the second game in the Sly Cooper series. Now, I don't see myself paying a visit to Warrior Within, Two Thrones, or any of the other games in the Prince of Persia series, but that's only because I've already released written reviews over them, and I think that anything else would be redundant. The point that I'm trying to make is for all the time that I've done these video reviews, I've been playing it relatively safe, so to speak. I've danced and pranced around games that have already proven themselves to be my cup of tea long ago. However, that's not the case with the game that I'm going to review for today's edition. I'd like to think that every gamer has had a moment like this come along. A moment where you have a little bit of chump change burning a hole in your pocket, not enough for you to go out and buy a new Xbox 360 or PS3 title, but enough so you can pick up something cheap at a pawn store or a game store. Well, basically that's kind of what happened whenever I purchased this game. I started out with $20, and after picking up the game that I went out of my way to get, I had about half or so left over to take a chance on a game or two. The game that I went out of my way to buy was Resident Evil 4 for the PlayStation 2, which I got for a cheap price of only $8 or $9. I had $11 left, and with that, I saw a vast repertoire of games I had never heard of on the original Xbox, PS2, and GameCube. I also saw a lot of games that I had heard of but never played, like Cold Fear and Vex. I didn't see the one other game that I was holding out for, which was an interactive game kind of similar to Heavy Rain called Fahrenheit, but there were some decent names out there. What you need to know is that I live in the middle of nowhere, so to speak. I don't actually live in a town. Where I live is actually labeled as a village. There's a gas station, a cafe, and that's it. The closest place that sells games is well over 3 or 4 miles away, which I know is hardly far, but I'm not going to be able to go and research on every game before I buy it. Thus, the flawless method of selection commences. Eeny, meeny, miny, mo. That one. Then voila! I left with Resident Evil 4, a game called Ani, and the game that I'll be reviewing today, Constantine. I'm actually surprised that I knew absolutely nothing about the Constantine character before purchasing this game. I mean, a prominent DC comic book character that I've been oblivious to for all this time. I suppose that stranger things have happened, and I was truly taken aghast by this character. A long-running series of comic books called Hellblazer, and a theatrical release of a movie starring Keanu Reeves as the title character. I've even read that they're making plans for a sequel. However, apparently this has been going on for over half a decade, so who knows if there's anything concrete to these rumors. Anyway, without further ado, I suppose that we should dive into the game that is Constantine. Constantine is an action-adventure video game developed by Bit Studio and published by THQ in 2005 for the Microsoft Windows, PlayStation 2, and original Xbox. There were supposed to be releases of the game for the Game Boy Advance and GameCube, but those apparently fell through the cracks. Now about the publishers and developers. Everybody pretty much knows about THQ. I mean, they made a ton of wrestling games, Saints Row, and pretty much they're known for, being able to crank out solid releases. Bit Studio, on the other hand, I had never heard of until playing this game. I did a little bit of digging and found out that they're actually responsible for some of the god-awful games published by LJN, which were, quite a few superhero games. They also made Rogue Ops, which was universally panned by critics. Needless to say, my feet couldn't have been colder if I were standing barefoot atop Mount Everest after a point. Mind you, the minute that I figured out this was essentially a movie game, I assumed it was going to be horrible. Was Constantine a bad game? Yes and no. The story involved in the game is actually really simple. Although they try to give it extra fluff to substitute for what should have been genuine depth, it ultimately sinks flat. I don't know about the series as a whole, or the movie, which I hope to review in the near future, but the story for the game seems forced. It reminds me of how in Star Trek you'd always hear the characters making sense out of jargon that really didn't make any sense whatsoever. So they could sound smarter and they'd instill a greater feeling of science fiction. This wasn't the exact same thing, and Star Trek didn't ultimately hurt itself with the dialogue. In fact, some would say that it was enhanced. However, that's just pretty much what it reminded me of. I'm having a bit of trouble summarizing my thoughts eloquently. The point that I'm trying to get across is that the happenings in the game didn't always come across as natural. Like they were really pushing the envelope on some things, but not on others. So it just didn't feel aligned. The game stars the main character from the comic book series, as you would expect, John Constantine, as he learns about the problem for him to solve in the game. Somehow, unholy spirits and animals are crossing into the realm of Earth without any care whatsoever, contrasting what was once the previous normal thing. He is then sent by his associate Beanon to assess the situation and investigate the problem. He, equipped with a compilation of spells and a crucifix shotgun, merrily skips around hell looking for all of Blue's clues. And that's pretty much as in-depth as it gets, really. You have quite a few antagonists to face throughout it all, but none of the characters have much personality or build to them. There's no insane cackling clowns to throw batarangs at, or men essentially controlling you by using the words, "would you kindly." There's just not a whole lot of anything with the characters or story. I'm giving the story a 5 out of 10 for its simplicity, lack of depth, character development, and overall underwhelmingness when you consider the fact that you're wandering around the depths of hell. For everything that they are, and for better or worse, the controls in this game are actually decent. I mean, I shoot the way I want to, and the reticule doesn't jump around like Tom Cruise on Oprah Winfrey's couch, so that's always good. It works pretty much exactly how you'd expect something like this to. The problem lies in the fact that it's too simple, there's no wit or ambition to it. Where's the precision and specificness of Resident Evil, or the fluency of something like Uncharted? I guess that I can't really bring Uncharted into this because they're entirely different games, but you see my point. The controls are cookie cutter, and bring really nothing to the table. One thing that I especially didn't like is the fact that you don't have the ability to jump in the game. Instead, you walk around and it automatically jumps to the nearby edge. This isn't necessarily a bad thing, and I mean, games like Resident Evil do it, and they turned out awesome. But moments in the game, this was a little nerve-wracking. There was one moment when I had to leap from one girder to the next, and I kept automatically overshooting the jump and falling to my death. So, like I said, for everything that it was and everything that it wasn't, I'm giving the controls a rating of 6 out of 10 for being decent, albeit uninspired. I remember whenever I looked at the cover of this game and I thought that the imagery would be admirable, and to be fair, everything except for the actual graphics were moderately decent. However, once you get a look at the game and see the graphics, not only will you see that they're horrible, you might as well see your lunch next. The graphics are buggy, choppy, and parallel something you would have seen on the PlayStation 1, which is just unacceptable. Developers of this game were given a ball to run with. They were allowed to depict hell of all places, a place for everything evil and diabolical, and seeing that this is what they came up with is beyond disappointing. Everything ultimately just looks so boring and repetitive. I liked how some of the monsters looked. I mean, they were every bit as choppy as everything else. But how they looked was the most inspired piece of the entire game. A well-deserved 4 out of 10 for graphics that looked cluttered, inconceivably bland, inexplicably tired, and just, The gameplay is questionable, the characters that you have to fight for the most part aren't very differentiating from a lot that we had already seen, and the way you kill them is usually pretty plain. The boss battles were, albeit at times frustrating, simplistic for the most part. They're frustrating in the sense that at times what you're supposed to do isn't very clear. However, once you unravel the small children's puzzles, it's a snap. Speaking of puzzles, the game implements quite a few puzzles, and by puzzles I mean that you have to move a crate every now and again. Players move around as John Constantine in an RPG-like style. They collect ammo, use magic, and can drink from a flask to regain health. The ability to use magic isn't nearly as cool as it sounds. It's nothing special, although I will admit that it's a dark horse in the game in the sense that it did make me enforce some type of strategy when battling the creatures. The level design is repetitive, and you'll probably find yourself doing the same thing more often than not. It feels this way especially when you take into account the fact that graphics illustrate hell, as this one-dimensional place with tiling backgrounds like a Flintstones cartoon. Also, the game has an alternative first-person view. Basically, your guy puts on glasses that make the room blue and bring more distinction to where the villains are and where you drop your bullets. It might have been kinda cool, hadn't it been first-person, and hadn't it looked kinda god-awful. The first person personally took me out of the atmosphere, it hurt the atmosphere, and just wasn't needed at all, and unfortunately, it's treated as a pivotal part in the game at some points. For all its mediocrity, it gets a 3 out of 10 from me. Okay, look, I don't really have too much to say about the game that hasn't already been mentioned. The game has tiresome controls, graphics, and a story that doesn't come off nearly as brilliant or complicated as the creators initially received. However, one of the other things that stood out abruptly to me was the voice acting. I don't believe that John Constantine is being portrayed by Keanu Reeves like he did in the movie, but I do know that the characters come off harshly forced and inadequate. The dialogue wasn't as much the problem, but the delivery. Constantine didn't come off as smooth-talking and witty like it seemed like they wanted to do. It sounded like a cold loner trying to come off as social. It may come across as relatively harsh to be giving a miscellaneous grade based entirely off of a single character's performance, but this is the main character we're talking about. The main character's portrayal sucked, and the performance of the other characters didn't necessarily do him any favors. I've been giving it a 4 out of 10. After all this has been said, I think that it needs to be said that I didn't absolutely hate the experience that I had with this game. Everything about it, for the most part, proved to be less than stellar. However, as a game, it's not as if I had to force myself to continue on with it. It's not like X-Blades or Damnation whenever I played them and I constantly wanted to quit. It kept my attention long enough for me to beat the game. The controls are so simple to the point that they're easy to navigate with, and there is much enjoyment to be had within this game. I wouldn't proclaim it as being one of the stereotypical movie game cash-ins, but more as something that took a chance only to have it bite them in the backside. The overall gaming experience of this game acquires a 6 out of 10 from me. bringing the overall rating of the game to a 4.6 out of 10. Thanks for joining me on this edition of the Golden View here on the Masochist Gaming Network, and I'll see you next time.